Hello, this is Mr. Fredericks. Today we have a screencast on the Pacific Theater of World War II, specifically the origins of the crisis. Now, our goals and objectives today are to study the origins, of course, but more importantly, once we understand the origins, maybe develop some theories or proposals about how we could have not got into this crisis, how we could have prevented it. So World War II was two wars, really. The European theater, which was the United States' war against Germany and Italy, and then, of course, they got a bunch of allies after that. And then the Pacific theater, totally different war, almost totally disconnected against Japan and its colonies. Now, the origins of the Japanese-American War, the Pacific theater, you can trace back a lot of years, but let's start in 1890. Japan at about this time was seeking power. It had begun to industrialize. And they had observed, quite keenly in fact, out of all the role models around them, specifically the European imperialists, that imperialism led to power. And there was lots of evidence of this. Specifically, the French had created this huge empire and became powerful, the Dutch as well, the British, and of course the US empire. So they had all these role models teaching them that imperialism was the way to survive. Now, another lesson that Japan saw was anybody who did not embrace imperialism tended to become weak, and those that were weak got conquered themselves. So not only did you have to engage in imperialism, if you didn't, you would be conquered. So that was Japan's conclusion, and they did not want to be conquered. So Japan had the wonderful idea, as of the 20th century, that they needed to begin conquering to survive, certainly to become powerful. Now, if you're going to conquer, where are you going to go? North or south? They could have gone in either direction. South, of course, would have been towards Indonesia, French Indochina, the Philippines, things like that. Um, and that would have been positive for them because Japan absolutely needed tons of raw materials, and going to the south would have got them those raw materials. However, they did not choose that path. Why? Well, in 1895, getting those raw materials wasn't a huge deal. Japan was already trading with the United States, and the United States was more than happy to sell Japan all the things they needed. So therefore, going south was not a priority. Plus, those that owned all the lands in the South, particularly the British, Netherlands, France, and the US, these imperialist powers were super powerful. Japan did not want to mess with them. So the alternative to the Southern strategy, which wasn't going to fly, was the Northern strategy, conquering to the north and to the west. Now, this is going to take Japan through Korea, Manchuria, which was part of China, China itself, and then Siberia, part of the Soviet Union. Now, the good news for Japan is that Russia and China were significantly less industrialized than, at this time, Western Europe and the United States. So that meant the northern strategy, or going to the north, was going to be the winner. So we have a little debate, southern or northern. We're going to the north, Japan figures. Russia and China are weak. Let's go that way. Now, what does that mean for Japan's future? Well, let's look at 1895. Japan decides to launch a war against China. Now, this war was over dominance of Korea, both of which kind of existed there. Now, China was the biggest country in the world, still is by population, and everyone was expecting that China would dominate Japan. But it doesn't matter. Japan crushes China, absolutely destroys them. And so going north seems to be going well so far. They're gaining a sphere of influence in Korea. But up next in 1904, just a short time after, Japan gets into another war with another country in the region that, now that China's out of the way, they want to take control. So, and that would be Russia. Now, Russia and Japan now are fighting over dominance of Korea, which what the last war was on, over the Sino-Japanese War, and Manchuria, that part of China that has so many raw materials and economic wealth. So that's what this war is going to be fought over, the Russo-Japanese War. And Russia is the largest country in the world by territory. So they're a powerhouse. Everybody's expecting them to win. And it doesn't matter because Japan crushes Russia, absolutely crushes them. Now, in the Russo-Japanese War. Now, at the end of that war, Korea gets annexed because the challengers are out of the way. Korea becomes Japan. And economic control over Manchuria, part of China, is established by Japan. Russia kind of gets it kicked out of its sphere of influence. Now, come 1905, Japan is exponentially more powerful. They've taken down two powers in the last 10 years. But in 1905 to 1930, Japan starts to really feel that they got some issues, some problems. And these problems are going to contribute to leading to World War II, of course. Problem number one, massive overpopulation. Japan is so tiny, yet they had such a huge population. The solution seems emigration, just like other countries when they have overpopulation. Now, the United States is the #1 country to accept immigrants. The problem was the US passed a law in 1924 called the National Origins Act that basically said that anybody from Japan cannot come into the United States, and 0%, in fact. So Japan's not allowed to have anybody go, and this is even a more extensive law than the Gentleman's Agreement that Teddy Roosevelt signed in 1906. Now, to solve this overpopulation issue with the US kind of closing its borders to Japan, Japan has an idea, and that's more imperialism. Now, they've already beat up China and Russia, but if they keep conquering, they'll have a place to give their surplus population. Now, problem number 2 that Japan is dealing with is just their size. They're a very tiny country. You can see on this map comparing them to the Soviet Union. So they have limited raw materials, and that makes it difficult for them to survive and expand. They have trouble feeding their population, a really large deal. So Japan says, you know what? The way out of this is we're going to get bigger. Now, how does Japan get bigger? More imperialism. Particularly, they want to go to the north. If they can just take control of China, that would be enough land and resources, they think. Problem number 3. In 1929, the stock market crashes, and that leads to the Great Depression and then a world depression. And Japan is struggling economically. Now, that's a problem because once Japan starts to break weak, economically speaking, that their people are suffering, just like people all around the world. And Japan got the idea that the way to deal with this economic suffering was more imperialism, to conquer their way out of it, to take the wealth from other nations by force. And problem number 4 that Japan was suffering at the beginning of the 20th century was that Asia itself was locked up. It had been conquered. The Asian peoples of the world, particularly the southeastern world, had been conquered by white imperialists, whether it's the British, the French, the Dutch, or the US. And Japan saw that as a terrible and awful thing. You know, there's the French Empire in Southeast Asia, there's the Dutch, there's the British, there's the Americans, pretty much everything. Japan is surrounded by white imperialists. And Japan wants to free all of the Asian people. Not free in the sense of giving them their freedom, but forming an empire where Japan would rule them in a better way than the white imperialists, I suspect, but or maybe not. So Japan says, I'm going to free these people, and I need to do that through imperialism by conquering them. So for those reasons, the path towards war begins. Those are a huge bit of the origins. Now, 1931 comes, and again, Japan is still wrestling with, do we go north or south to expand our power? And again, that's complicated because both issues are complicated, of course. But the northern strategy in 1931 wins out, and here's the reason why. So this is a chart that's kind of demonstrating the southern versus northern pros and cons, and the reason why they want to go north is that the Soviet Union and China are still weaker than the imperialist powers that are located to the south of Japan. So in 1931, Japan decides, I'm going to go against the weaker powers in my path to expansion, and they take their first step, which is to take out Manchuria, which is part of China. Now, they already had economic control in a kind of a sphere of influence type of way, but they didn't have military control or control over the land. So an incident's going to be manufactured, and Japan is going to invade Manchuria and physically take it over. Now, the US is angry about this. We think imperialism is wrong at this point. And as sad as we weren't so sad that we were going to declare war over it. And we also weren't so sad that we weren't going to continue trading oil and steel with Japan as they conquered Manchuria. We were basically providing them the oil and steel they needed to keep this war up. But hey, it was the Great Depression. We needed all the trade we could get. China was also upset, but they were too weak to go up against Japan, which was fully industrialized at this point. So hopefully we can rely on the League of Nations, Woodrow Wilson's idea from the Treaty of Versailles, in order to save Manchuria, help China out. But nope, all the countries of the League of Nations were completely distracted with the Great Depression and bad memories of World War I. They didn't want to go fight to save Manchuria. So either way, Manchuria goes bye-bye. Japan renames it, takes it over. Now, 5 years go by in the 1930s, and we're at 1936. So Japan still is wrestling with this decision. Do we expand our power by going to the north or to the south? Now, the northern strategy continues to win, and they're already on that path. So let's hear those arguments, and there's a lot of them. Number one, right now the United States is providing Japan pretty much all the raw materials they need. So if Japan invades to the south, they're going to take out U.S. colonies, and that's going to lead to the U.S. no longer trading with them. They don't want to disrupt that by going to the south, so they should go to the north so they don't get the U.S. to do that. Number two, The number two reason why Japan wants to conquer to the north and not to the south is the Japanese army is stronger than its navy. The army, if you're going to conquer to the north, that's all land battles with China and the Soviet Union. If you conquer to the south, that's all ocean and islands, and it requires a stronger navy. And the Japanese army had more control and more power at this point. So Japan's going to go to the north. Again, that Japanese army was super powerful. They claimed they could defeat all of China in 3 months. And their army was certainly stronger than the Navy, which could not conduct that huge war just yet. To the south, I mean. So another argument why the Japanese should conquer to the north and not to the south was that China and the Soviet Union continued not being very strong, while the European white imperialists had proven that they were very strong, traditionally speaking. So again, those European powers that owned all the land to the south of Japan, super unbelievably strong. But Russia and China, meanwhile, were still not fully industrialized. So in evidence of this, just 20-something years before that, Japan had crushed them in the Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War. And so they said, hey, we can do that again. It'll be easy. We've already showed we can dominate these powers. So another example of why going up against China and the Soviet Union was the better choice was that at this point, Germany had offered to help with the Soviet Union indirectly. What do I mean by that? Well, specifically in 1936, Germany, Italy, and Japan had signed a treaty, the Anti-Comintern Pact, and this treaty basically allied them together against the Soviet Union because all three of those countries worried about the Soviet Union, a historically challenging power. Now, by having that power, Japan's like, you know what? We go north, we fight the Soviet Union, our ally is with Germany. So Germany will attack from the west, we'll attack from the south and the east, we'll take out the Soviet Union. It will be easy with Germany as our ally because Germany appeared very powerful in the 30s. So the northern strategy just seems to keep getting good arguments. And then there's another argument, the Chinese Civil War was going on. So if you studied in world history, China in 1937 was in the middle of its own war. So Japan was like, you know what? Well, let's attack China now while they're divided. The Chinese nationalists and the Chinese communists were battling each other. So that's going to make them weaker as they are divided. So let's take them out when they're weaker. So in 1937, for all of those reasons, it just made sense to continue the war to the north rather than attacking the south. So the northern strategy wins out, and Japan decides to take their next step. So 1937, war with China begins, and the Japanese troops, which were already in Manchuria, launch against mainland China proper. So, and that war starts, and Japan absolutely crushes China, particularly at first, but the war goes on for a painfully long time. While Japan is conquering lots of land, China is just huge, and China is not surrendering at any cost. So from 1937 to 1940, Japan thought they had a quick war and would quickly be able to move on. But nope, they have a new problem, in fact. They cannot get China to surrender, but their new problem is that the United States is slowly losing its sense of isolationism. So they start trading, and why are they so upset? Well, other than just not liking that Japan is starting to conquer and imperialism is wrong, the U.S., as China gets locked down with war with Japan, the U.S. isn't able to trade with China. And of course, China is one of the countries that the U.S. trades with most, and the U.S. gets a lot of wealth by trading with China. And now you're messing with U.S. money during the Great Depression. Now, the U.S. isn't willing to take any actions yet against Japan, even after 3 years of Japan attacking China. And the U.S., in fact, still keeps trading with Japan the steel they need and the oil, basically funding the war against China. So complicated. But when you get to 1940, we're going to really dive into the reasons why the war between Japan and the U.S. happens. Because in 1940, the United States basically at this point is starting to stand up to Japan and tells Japan they need to stop attacking China. Japan, of course, says, no, mind your business. It's okay for the United States to create this huge empire through imperialism. But now that it's Japan's turn, now they're all to think it's immoral and wrong. So Japan says no, and tensions rise because the U.S. is like, you need to get out of China, and Japan's like, no. So the U.S. reacts in 3 ways as they sense Japan is now one of its top enemies in the world. The United States orders 150 more ships to get built. basically saying it needs a two-ocean navy. So the US has got some conflict with Germany at this point, but realizes it needs a whole second navy to protect its assets in the Pacific against Japan. So it orders those ships, and Japan sees this as a direct threat against them, and they should, because it entirely was. So number two thing that the United States does now that tensions rise with Japan, the US moves a massive number of troops into the Philippines, increases the amount of troops that the US has in its colony of the Philippines. So now that Japan sees this as a threat, once again, it was directly to safeguard against Japanese expansion. Number three, the US starts giving gifts and aid to China, who's been under attack for 3 years at this point. Under the Lend-Lease bill, starts supporting them with weapons. Now, how do they get there? Well, the US is going to smuggle these weapons in through French Indochina. Now, French Indochina is an area that the French controlled to the south of China that today we would call Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. However, back then it was French Indochina. And what the US did was we smuggled weapons through a famous railway there. And those got to China. Now, Japan was angry about US support of China because these weapons were directly leading to Japanese loss of life. The Japanese should have defeated China very quickly, but because of US weapons, China was hanging on, and Japan saw these weapons as stopping their goals for creating their empire. So from 1940 to 1941, Japan's mind started to change. This northern strategy, Japan's like, you know what, this might not be the best way to go. And this is the key to the origin of the US war with Japan, because they changed their minds. Japan starts looking at the US. Now, specifically, all those reasons you can see on your screen about why Japan wanted to go to the north just become less and less meaningful. Why is the Southern plan more appealing? Well, let's look at it. Number one, the US now seemed to be replacing the Soviet Union as the number one threat against Japan. So taking out the US now seemed like a higher priority, and the US colonies were to the south. Also, Japanese army had lost credibility. Now remember, if you're going to attack to the north of Japan, those are land battles. And if you're going to attack to the south, they're going to be naval battles. So the Japanese army had lost some credibility. They promised to defeat China in 3 months. It was 3 years and they were making no progress. It was a complete stalemate. So at this point, the Japanese army was overstretched and seemed trapped in China. So China wasn't really doing well. The northern strategy just didn't seem successful. Also, what we had not talked about yet was Japan had actually battled and invaded the Soviet Union the year before in 1939. So from 1938 to 39, there were some border skirmishes. And Japan launched an all-out attack onto the Soviet Union. And in 2 major battles, or that whole area, the Japanese are going to get crushed, soundly defeated. It doesn't get much talk about in our textbook, but the Soviet Union just won by their sheer size and numbers and armor. So the invasion of the Soviet Union and going to the north just didn't seem feasible. They tried and they completely failed. So by 1940, ideas and advocacy in Japan for the northern strategy to expand power severely weakened, but also the southern became more and more appealing because Hitler had weakened the imperialists. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, Great Britain, France, the Netherlands, and the US were the ones to the south of Japan that owned all those colonies. Now, at this point, 2 out of those four powers, France and the Netherlands, were conquered, and the British were being crushed by Hitler. So being crushed and conquered, how could they possibly dedicate troops to protect their colonies? So those colonies were completely susceptible and weak to Japanese expansion at this point. Now, again, Hitler's, with his empire, is going to create a vacuum because those European powers can't possibly protect their colonies. So that power vacuum, Japanese are like, we'll fill it. We'll take over that area. So again, just to remind you, that's the French Empire, which is now susceptible because the French have been conquered. And again, here's the Dutch Empire. The Dutch have been conquered. The British are being crushed, and so now their possessions are open. So it seems like it's time to attack, as good as any for the Japanese. And another argument for why going to the south is probably the way to power for the Japanese. The Japanese Navy is now significantly more stronger than it's ever been. So originally the army was stronger. Basically because back in 1921, the Japanese had agreed to a treaty, the Washington Naval Conference, and that naval conference basically, along with, the 1930 London Naval Treaty, limited the size of the Japanese Navy. The Japanese, the British, and the US weren't allowed to build more boats for the most part, so the Japanese Navy was stuck in being relatively small. But in 1936, the Japanese announced they're not going to follow the Washington or London naval treaties, and they just ripped it up. And now the Japanese from 1936 on were just building an endless amount of military ships. So Japan was now free to expand, and that's what they did. They built an endless number of ships. And in 1940, their navy was actually stronger, maybe relatively so, to their army. So at this point, the navy was like, let's go south. Let's conquer all these islands and all these colonies because we're now strong enough to do it. So in addition to that, another reason why the southern route made sense was if Japan conquered the south, they could then completely block off China, and no allies like the US would be able to sneak weapons to China, and then China would have to give up. So again, it was a means to the end. So given all of these reasons, and there were a lot of reasons, Japan completely changed their mind, and they were no longer going to go attack to the north, they were going to go south. So it's almost like Japan's ready to attack the South and the US and those imperialist powers. But in 1941, there were still obstacles, two specifically that prevented Japan from going to war right then. So the two obstacles were this: the Non-Aggression Pact of 1939 and the fact that the US was still trading all the things Japan needed. So Japan didn't have to go to the South to go conquer and get raw materials because they still had them from the US. So then 1941 happens. We're close to the war now. Things change. Those obstacles go away. Let me explain. The first obstacle is removed in September 23rd, 1940, when Japan decides that they're going to invade the northern part of French Indochina, a French possession, because France is obviously weakened at this point. Now, the reason they're doing this is because they want to stop weapons from being smuggled to China. So they go to the northern, French Indochina to do this. Now, the U.S., of course, is angry because now they can't smuggle weapons to China. But this is another example of more imperialism. The U.S. had already told Japan to get out of China, stop conquering China. And now Japan does the exact opposite. They conquer French Indochina. So the U.S. is angry. So to motivate Japan to leave French Indochina and China itself, the U.S. says, get out of China and French Indochina, or we're going to cut off trade with you. We're going to stop trading you oil, scrap metal, aviation fuel, and Japan at this point gets scared. This is the first time the U.S. has formally threatened this. Japan needs its oil to run all of its factories. It needs its oil to run its military. So Japan is in a very precarious, dangerous situation. If the U.S. cuts off trade, they are through. They are done. So they know Japan no longer can rely on trade from the U.S. to get the oil and steel they need. This is a pivotal moment, and if you're looking for why Japan attacked the U.S. at Pearl Harbor, you can trace it to right here. The U.S. could crush Japan at any point, which made the Japanese vulnerable, and they could not have that. So in response, Japan prepares for the southern option. No longer talking about it, they actually get ready to carry it out because they are that desperate not to have the U.S. have so much control over them. So if they need to, if the U.S. stops selling them oil, they can conquer it themselves. Specifically, the oil is located in the Dutch East Indies, which today is Indonesia, and the British Malaya. So they're going to go to the south, prepare for that. Now, the Japanese still don't start conquering that land because there is still one obstacle that prevented them from going all out in the south, and that was the Non-Aggression Pact of 1939. So the Japanese saw the Soviet Union as their number one enemy. But the problem was that the Soviet Union in 1939 signed a non-aggression agreement with Hitler, Germany. So now the Soviet Union could completely rely on peace to the West and use all of its resources to attack Japan if necessary. Japan couldn't take the Soviet Union one-on-one. So what Japan didn't want to happen, since they just had a failed war with the Soviet Union, they didn't want to attack to the south and then get attacked by the Soviet Union in the north. They couldn't win that two-front war. They couldn't take on the U.S. and the Soviet Union. But on June 22nd, 1941, that obstacle is removed. Specifically, when Hitler breaks the Non-Aggression Pact of 1939, when Hitler attacks the Soviet Union, when Hitler betrays his friend Stalin and invades the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union gets crushed and has to dedicate all of its troops and resources to holding back Hitler. So the Soviet Union is completely busy and distracted and wants nothing to do with Japan. Right around that time, the Soviet Union was more than willing to sign a peace agreement with Japan. And that agreement said Japan and the Soviet Union will be friends. They won't attack each other anymore. And this would allow the Soviet Union to completely dedicate its resources towards the Soviet Union. And Japan now could dedicate all of its resources to the South, without worrying about taking on the US and the Soviet Union at the same time. So in the summer of 1941, the choice is finally clear. Japan, in order to secure its raw materials, which it desperately needs because the US can't be counted on anymore, on July 28, 1941, this is right after the Soviet Union got invaded by Hitler, Japan sends 140,000 Japanese troops in order to prepare for its invasion of the Dutch East Indies from northern French Indochina, which it had already conquered, to southern Indochina. This is the absolute, almost penultimate step towards war with the United States. So Japan moves its troops to southern French Indochina to prepare for that next invasion to secure its oil. Ironically, it's trying to protect its oil, but the United States was so angry by Japan conquering all of French Indochina that this was perceived as Japan finally going over the line. So what the US did was it froze all of the Japanese assets in the US, billions of dollars, which basically had the reality of it was it's going to prevent Japan from being able to purchase any U.S. goods. And that formal embargo gets put in place, and now Japan is no longer has access to U.S. oil, U.S. scrap metal, U.S. aviation fuel, meaning Japan, it's just a clock ticking before they are completely rendered weak and useless. So in the summer of 1941, Japan realizes they can't survive. They do start peace negotiations with the U.S., but the decision is mostly made already. Japan is down to their final decision, war or peace, and the unlikely decision they would make is what the U.S. wants. The U.S. has demanded that they leave China and that they go from being a powerful country, which they were, to back to being weak again. And if they do that, then the U.S. will start giving it oil. And Japan's like, absolutely not. We're not going back to being weak again. So the other choice for Japan is to overcome the U.S. oil embargo and to go conquer the oil, which we talked about, the southern strategy. So they're going to go into the Dutch East Indies and take that oil and then take this decision out of the U.S. hands. So this means, unfortunately for Japan, that if they're going to attack to the south, that means war with the UK, war with the Netherlands, war with France. Now, lucky for them, those three countries are pretty much being dominated by Hitler, right? And war with the US, which is not yet in World War II. So Japan has to think about this. Do I really want to keep doing this? Do I really want war over peace? Now, they're thinking, can we win a war with the US? Because we don't want to join World War II. We don't want to conquer to the south if we can't beat the US. And in the autumn of 1941, Japan basically said, you know what, right now, in 1941, the Japanese have a navy 70% of the size of the US. And right then, the Japanese still has plenty of oil. And right then, Japan still has plenty of steel. But if Japan waits at all, the US industrial strength will just get stronger. And Japan's oil and steel will run out. So if Japan's going to attack, it has to be now. Because as longer they wait, the United States is just going to get stronger. Because the United States has 14 times the industrial capability of the Japanese. And that means every plane the Japanese push out, the US can push out so many more. Every tank the Japanese create, the US can create so many more tanks. So it's just a matter of time before the United States is massively powerful. So Japan says if they're going to go to war, it needs to be now. A delayed war, Japan won't win. A long-term war, Japan can't possibly win. However, a war right now and right then, Japan could win with the US. That's what they determined. So the solution is to strike immediately while Japan still had oil, still had steel, and still had factory production that equaled somewhat of the United States. So Japan allows the peace negotiations with the US to fail. They don't agree to leave French Indochina, don't agree to leave China. And the Japanese strategy is basically, with the Japanese the year before had formed a three-country, an Axis Pact, the Axis Pact, which was an agreement, a military agreement with the Nazis in Italy. And what that pact had done was it basically said that those three countries would act in defense of each other. So if the U.S. came into this war, those countries would all declare war on the U.S. So what that meant for the Japanese was that they knew the U.S. would know that they had a two-ocean war against the Japanese in the Pacific and then Italy and Germany in the Atlantic. And what that meant, that alliance, was they believed that if the Japanese attacked the U.S., that the U.S. would seek peace rather than attack the Japanese. The Japanese could destroy the U.S. entire navy at Pearl Harbor, but the U.S. still wouldn't be willing to attack the Japanese because they would want to go after Hitler, the higher priority. So the Japanese knew they couldn't beat the US, but they thought the US would agree to a peace so that the US could focus on Hitler. A very rational point of view. It just turned out to be wrong. So when the Japanese strike first against the United States, they attack at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and they crush the U.S. Navy. Now, again, that's the planner of this attack was Admiral Yamamoto, and his famous quote, "The U.S. Pacific Fleet is a dagger pointed at our throat. Let's destroy it." And that's what they do on a day that will live in infamy, December 7th, 1941. So 4 days later, according to, again, their alliance, the Axis Pact, Germany and Italy are going to declare war on the United States. And that is the beginning of World War II in both theaters for the United States. Now, Japan does continue with its southern strategy. They start conquering all these places, and they create a defensive perimeter in southeastern Asia, hoping that the U.S. will look at this as impenetrable and will agree to a compromise, a peace, and go focus on Germany. And that was their goal. Now, the problem with the situation is that Japan vastly underestimated how angry the U.S. would be after the attack on Pearl Harbor, which is often the case. So the U.S. was so angry that we never would have agreed to a compromise. In fact, very quickly after that, FDR demands an unconditional surrender from both Germany and Japan. So the war continues. Now, our objective at the beginning of this presentation was to understand the origins of the Pacific War, why it happened, and to develop some ideas on how we could have prevented it. So your next assignment, which will be found in Google Classroom, will be based on coming up with ideas of how we could have stopped this timeline, this pattern of behavior that led to World War II. Thank you very much. And again, look for your assignment in Google Classroom.